we've stabilised the economy by making these cuts, so it's time to reverse them. Which makes no sense. There is no logic to it whatsoever. The truth is that if anything, the Chancellor's fiscal position has deteriorated since she made those cuts.
It didn't affect the poorest. It didn't affect the ones who were really going to suffer. It was often taken away from people who did have disposable income. I mean, why was there such an outcry then?
The winter fuel thing was a sort of lowest hanging fruit of the kind of pensioner bit of the welfare state. Young working age families are going to be working partly using their taxes to pay for winter fuel allowance for incredibly asset-rich pensioners. This is mental.
Do you think the public want politicians to be honest with them?
Yes, of course.
OK, so can you just be honest about winter fuel allowance, that you reversed it because of poor local election results, you realised it was really unpopular, and you listened to voters? That is the truth, isn't it?
Well, of course we listen to voters all of the time. That's part and parcel of being a politician. The first question is, did we make the right decision in the first place? I believe we did, because we needed to stabilise the economy. And the result of that...
That is Keir Starmer saying, yeah, we were right with the winter fuel allowance last year, and we're right this year. It's not a big U-turn, it's just that we've stabilised the economy. Does anyone actually believe that?
The gap in total spending on children and pensioners has widened by 170% in real terms. So why don't we care about the position of young people as much as we seem to care about pensioners? Are they simply off limits for our politicians? Welcome to the Newsagents.
It's John.
It's Emily.
It's Lewis.
And if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it's a duck. Except now it's not a U-turn, it's not a climb down, it's not a policy reversal. They were right the first time round to introduce the cap on the winter fuel allowance, and they're right again now to lift it for 75% of pensioners. I'm not sure anyone is buying the explanation that is currently on offer from Keir Starmer downwards.
It's very revealing, I think, the fact that Starmer is insisting that his cabinet ministers go out and defend this deeply contorted logic. Because actually one of the things about this government over the course of the last year, it's actually had a pretty ironclad will. This is its first major U-turn, its first major reversal. And you can see, I think they feel uncomfortable about it for all sorts of reasons. And so what they're doing, partly to try and sort of assuage themselves in a way, or assure themselves that they're still projecting this kind of power and authority, is they're basically making cabinet ministers go out there, including the Prime Minister himself, saying, we've stabilised the economy by making these cuts, so it's time to reverse them. Which makes no sense. There is no logic to it whatsoever. The truth is that if anything, the Chancellor's fiscal position has deteriorated since she made those cuts last year. And so we're in a position now, a pretty sort of crazy position, I think, really, where largely because of the political reaction, and we've talked on the show before, it is no doubt this has had a serious, this idea around winter fuel, it's embedded itself seriously with the public. We're now in a situation where, as a result of the changes they announced yesterday, there'll be a threshold where, in a couple where one person is aged 80, they'll receive £200. The other will receive £100. The person over 80 will repay £200 if their income is more than $35,000 a year. But that will create some quirks, this new system, right? Because a single pensioner living alone will repay the full £200 or £300 if their income is more than $35,000 a year, while a couple with an income of $69,000 would keep all of the money. And of course, this is on the basis of income. So you could have a pensioner who has £1 million in the bank, who is off all year, sort of sailing around the world, sort of, having a great retirement, good luck to them, but would still qualify for the winter fuel payment. So when the government says that we're taking it away from all rich pensioners, that is not necessarily the case. If you have a lot of assets but no income, you're getting this money.
Yeah, and I guess the question that it really raises is, what is it about the pensioner class, the pensioner set of society, which makes the government so scared of upsetting them. And it is something, I mean, you can read the polling and definitely, the government has a point. 49% of people believe that more money should be found to maintain the services that go to older people as the number of retired people grows, even if that means more taxes for younger generations. But it is extraordinary when you actually look at the breakdown on real per person public spending, which on pensioners increased by 55% between 2004 and last year. And it was just 20% for children. And as I said at the beginning, that has created this massive imbalance, a massive gap in total spending on children and pensioners, which has widened by 170%. And of course, you don't have to set generations off against each other. I mean, many children want their grandparents to be well looked after and warm and well fed and solvent. Of course they do. And I guess many, middle-aged people are thinking, well, that's fine because it's going to be me next. Don't take away anything that will be part of my retirement and my old age. But it does suggest somewhere along the lines that even Labour, which is massively supported by the young and massively out of favour by the over 65s, doesn't feel able to turn around and say, broadly, the pensioners are pretty well looked after compared to working age families, compared to younger people.
I suppose, look, in answer to your question, why is this? Why does this happen? There's a short answer in 2 words and there's a longer answer in 8 words. And the short answer is old people, they vote. And the longer answer is they vote in higher numbers than young people. Therefore, voter power rests with older people. We are going to give them much more muscle. Do you think of the lobbying groups that exist around, the elderly, age concern, whatever, help the aged? They've got very well organised lobby groups that are there to defend, rightly, the concerns of old people. I'm trying to think of what are the lobbying groups that are there to help young people, whether it's children.
Well, Action for Children. I mean, I think there are a lot of charities that deal with kids that are in greater poverty.
But the political class are much more frightened, are concerned or are keener to assuage the opinion of old people than they are the young.
Well, particularly after reform, look as if they're knocking at the door in the local elections, yeah.
I think, as well, John, to add to your analysis, I think there's the other element to it, which is that it's true, older people have always voted more. I mean, that has always been the case. The other thing that's changing, of course, is that older people as a proportion of the population is getting bigger and bigger every year. Britain, like other Western societies, is becoming a gerontocracy. If I were to put it, to be a bit provocative about it, I would say that what this whole winter fuel thing shows is that this is sort of proof that Britain is becoming, politically speaking, a nursing home with a state attached to it. The interests, I'm serious, I mean, the interests of, because older people are growing as a proportion of the electorate all the time, it is almost inevitable, because of the way democracy works, that politicians are subconsciously or otherwise, bit by bit, re-gearing their interests and what they offer in favour of those people versus a smaller group, which is younger people. And the reason I say, and the reason I'm actually quite disturbed by this winter fuel thing is that I would completely understand if a politician was going after pensions itself, why there would be an almighty backlash. Even the triple lock. Because actually, in relative terms, the British pension is not especially generous by comparison to other European countries. The winter fuel thing was a sort of lowest hanging fruit of the kind of pensioner bit of the welfare state. Something introduced by Gordon Brown in the late 90s that, frankly, by definition, we can't have cared about that much as a society, because if we had done, we would have actually uprated it with inflation. It's basically been at 200 or 300 quid for years. It's been depreciating in real terms. There's almost something about the symbolism of this. It's not even really about the policy. It's about the symbolism and the kind of political backlash which has been generated, which is that it is almost the case that no matter how minor a benefit is for old people, that it is untouchable. And that comes against a general backdrop of 15 years where pretty much every other component of society, every other demographic, has had serious, serious pain. So I worry about the message that this sends to not just this government, but future governments, which is basically all of this stuff, which is a bigger and bigger proportion of overall spending. It's untouchable. It's untouchable. It's a third rail. You have to go out after other people.
Okay, but
and I think that has all sorts of perverse perverse outcomes to it.
I think we have to accept the part that we, the media, have played in this, though, because it wasn't very long.
Yeah.
I mean, it was just after the local elections that you said, the cardinal sin of this government was dropping the winter fuel. Certainly the line we've had from all the pollsters has been, if you knock on people's doors, they say winter fuel. I mean, why were people saying winter fuel? Was it that the media ran a very, very strong campaign saying they're starving the elderly, they're taking away the heat of the elderly in the middle of this, terrible cost of living crisis? We know the poorest and the most vulnerable were protected anyway with pensioner credit. And so in a way, I sort of, you do have to pause and think what the government's wondering at this moment, because everyone has told them for the last year that the most terrible thing they did was drop the winter fuel thing when they came into office, right? For many people, if you took away all the sound and the fury, as you say, it's low-hanging fruit. It didn't affect the poorest. It didn't affect the ones who were really going to suffer. It was often taken away from people who did have disposable income. I mean, why was there such an outcry then? Because now they've turned it round and everyone's going, oh, what's that about?
Well, I just think that the question of it, the U-turn, and it seemed to me that the messaging could be so much cleverer on this. Look, we came into power, we were just horrified, terrified by what we saw in terms of the black hole in the nation's finances, and we thought, oh my God, we've got to do something quickly. We acted very quickly on that, and maybe with hindsight, we should have just thought and paused a bit and listened to more people, and we didn't realise the upset it would cause. I mean, it doesn't go to your point, Lewis, about, making old people untouchable, but it would have at least kind of cleared up the messaging. Yeah, we screwed up.
Rich old people, to be specific.
Yeah.
Rich old people.
Yeah, exactly. Completely. And I think that, as you say, it has withered on the vine. But once something has been given to people, it's very hard to say we're having it back. And that's the key political point in this.
So I think there's two components to it on that. I mean, you're right. I mean, for example, when I said it was the cardinal sin or original sin,
I'm not singling you out.
No,
I'm saying
I know,
everyone was saying, we heard
true.
from all the pollsters saying that's the one thing we get told on the doorstep.
Look,
so of course, if you're the government, you think, okay, we've got to reverse it.
And I think it amazed the government, and to be honest, has amazed me, the extent to which, when you go around talking to people, it's the thing that they bring up.
Yeah.
Like, it's become a meme. It's almost like tuition fees or something was for the Lib Dems again. And I think that's reflective of two things. One, I think it was done, and we talked about this at the time and since, it was done in a cack-handed way. There was no pitch rolling for it. It came out of nowhere. And I think that reflects or connects us to the second thing, which is that if you are going to go after, let's be honest, in this case, richer old people, then that pitch rolling and that strategy has to be even more attuned and really Rolls Royce.
So it's the comms. I mean, it's the comms that screwed up.
I think it's structurally difficult to go after older people, not least when it's a Labour government doing it and you've got the right wing press against you. So it's partly
the first act.
And it's
after 14 years.
Exactly,
yeah.
And there wasn't any. But now we're in this kind of crazy situation, and I do think, and this is bigger than winter fuel. It's just. And again, what disturbs or depresses me about it is the extent to which I think this problem is just going to get worse now. Is that, if we're honest, it has never been harder, and this is true on all sorts of stats, to be a young, and not just when I say young, I'm talking about
up to 40,
people of
really.
working age,
Absolutely.
working age family in this country, right? Particularly if you've gone to university, your marginal tax rate can be north of 50% at a time when housing costs are incredibly high, childcare costs are incredibly high, and now we're in this crazy situation now where potentially young working age families are going to be working, partly using their taxes to pay for winter fuel allowance for incredibly asset-rich pensioners. This is mental.
Yeah, I tell you where I disagree with you. You know what? The government is going after very wealthy pensioners who've got their money in private pension pots, which would have been free of inheritance tax, and that they would have been able to pass on to their children. And the government, and because it's more complicated to understand than the simplicity of the winter fuel allowance, Rachel Reeves is going after that, and that is going to massively affect pensioners. And and I bet you there are going to be other changes.
Yes.
Yeah, rich pensioners.
Yes.
But I think to say that she's not doing anything about rich pensioners because of this change to the winter fuel allowance is to get it wrong. I think the wealthy are going to get absolutely clobbered by it. I would make
a different, slightly bigger argument, which I think this is something that we've got to address in this country. The fact is that people who are asset rich are taxed, generally speaking, far less than people who are of working age and working for their income. And that is a problem which has got worse, and it's got worse, and it's got worse. And there is a massive discrepancy in the tax system. And I think that, generationally speaking, you've had generations at the older end of things now who had the golden goose. They would have, not their fault. They lived at a time where generally, on almost every level, they've had it better than almost any other generation. Younger people have not had that, and it is unfair to expect them to continue to have higher and higher marginal rates of income, which prevent them from gaining those assets at a time when those assets of the wealthy continue to be, relatively speaking, undertaxed.
I thought it was very significant that Paul Johnson, who's the outgoing director of the IFS, was asked yesterday on the BBC if he was trying to spend £1.25 billion on a poverty-solving measure, would the winter fuel be in his top 5? And he said it wouldn't even be in my top 100. And to your point, child poverty is really stubbornly high at 30%. So if you turn round the whole thing and say not just how do we tax rich pensioners, but what should we be doing to alleviate poverty, pensioner poverty has fallen to 16% and child poverty is at 30%. So just that sense of imbalance. Now, of course, you can argue that pensioners can't go out and earn their own money and that they're at a stage in life where they're not having, they haven't got an income. There's many poor pensioners. But to get that sense of the disparity, maybe that's why young people aren't voting, because they don't see the point.
I suppose that, look, if the government were here to answer for itself, it would say, look what we announced last week, with free school meals for those on income support, and that will take 100,000 people out of child poverty, and that is a significant move and broadly has been welcomed. Is there more they can do? Of course there is.
Well, let me just give one example of where I think this whole thing ends up having, our national conversation becomes perverted because we are so afraid of taking on particularly asset rich pensioners. Look at social care. When Theresa May comes along in 2017, and by the way, with her social care proposals, actually had a very sensible proposal. I mean, it basically torpedoes her election campaign. But why did it torpedo her election campaign? Because she was basically saying that at some point after your death, part of the sale of your home would have to go to fund the cost of your care. This was not an unreasonable position, right? This was not an unreasonable position. But it was so politically toxic. That it completely destroyed her election campaign, right? And as a result, no politicians wanted to touch it since. And as a result,
look at Andrew Dilnot. How long ago was that report? 20 years?
But the net result of politicians, and I'm not just saying let's leave aside the merits or otherwise of that particular proposal, but inevitably what it means is that if you're going to tackle social care, you are going to basically bring in the assets of wealthier pensioners, which is their homes. And that is so toxic that basically no politician wants to touch it, which means what happens? Well, it's working age, younger people who have to, through their taxes on their income, which are already at historic highs, basically having to pay for an unreformed care system. And that is because our politics, through the newspapers, let's be honest, which are owned by and read by older people, basically gets squeezed out of all proportion to where the overall population is.
Well, in a moment, we will be back with the leader of the SNP in Westminster, 1 week on from their very disappointing by-election result in Scotland.
Well, Stephen Flynn joins us now. He's the SNP's leader in Westminster. And just looking back, Stephen, last week you tweeted, Labour have given up in Hamilton. You were talking about the Scottish parliamentary election there. Labour have given up. So Nostradamus, how's that working out for you then?
Well, I think for a little bit of context for your listeners, I was referring to the fact that a candidate for the Labour Party wasn't willing to do TV debates. So if we look at that in isolation, I think it makes a little bit more sense. But yeah, we're not escaping from the fact that the Labour Party won the by-election by a relatively small margin over ourselves. And look, as a starting point, see if someone had said to me last year, because I recall it very vividly, as I'm sure you can understand, when the general election happened in that area of Scotland, we were seeing Labour majorities of 9,000-10,000. The other day we seen a Labour majority of 600 or so. I'm quite annoyed we didn't get over the threshold to take the seat, but I think it reflects the fact that there's been a significant change of the tide in Scotland. The Labour Party has fallen quite far. We've steadied. We've not gone up enough. We've got more to do. But I think if we do a little bit more, we should be in a good position for next year.
This change in the tide has to recognise, surely, reform. And the SNP have told us for decades that Nigel Farage and his kind of politics just wouldn't wash in Scotland. That's not true.
Well, I think the result itself kind of speaks to a lot of that. And I think for those of us who are in politics and have been in politics for a while, we need to reflect upon ourselves and the arguments that we're making to the public. We need to focus less on polling and focus groups and more on policies and people. And I think if we do that, we can reconnect with the public and tell them that we've got the answers.
You've been in power for nearly 2 decades. I mean, if you haven't been focusing on policies up till now, what on earth have you been doing in government?
Yeah, no, we of course we have. And I could go through all the announcements that were made in the last year and at the budget, where John Swinney managed to get agreement from other parties. And like I say, we have steadied and made a small amount of progress, but there is more to do. And in the run up to that election, we need to make, in the election next year in Edinburgh, we need to make sure that we are fully focused on taking reform on policy. Because whether it's net zero, the NHS, the economy, their answers don't work for Scotland, and we've got better ones.
But Stephen, isn't the most significant thing that's happened in Scottish politics in most recent time is not the fall in the Labour vote since they've come to power? It is the rise of reform, which seems remorseless. And has there been a complacency in just an assumption that in Scotland we're more progressive, we're more pro-European, we are more this, we are more that? Actually, maybe you're just the same in Scotland as everywhere else in the UK.
I think we have to accept that irrespective of where you are in the UK or indeed in Europe or further afield in the Western world, that people are scunnered right now. They're scunnered because their energy bills are high, the cost of living doesn't seem to get any better for them. They're working harder for less. And when you add all that together and people come along who are relatively new faces, even though Nigel's been around for decades, he's very good at reinventing himself with some easy, straightforward solutions. The problem is that those solutions don't actually make sense. They don't add
Sorry,
up.
Steve,
That's
that's
where we
not
need to
good
take them
enough.
on.
You've been in power for 20 years, almost, right? You've got the highest drugs death rate in Europe. You've got 1 in 6 Scots stuck on an NHS waiting list. You've fallen behind in health. You've fallen behind in education.
Emily,
Yeah.
I think when we go through those individual issues, so if we're wanting to talk about the NHS in Scotland, the NHS in Scotland is under severe pressure. Everyone knows that. Everyone recognises that. We've got the legacy of the COVID pandemic. But just the other month, the First Minister announced 100,000 new GP appointments. We know that we've got the best performing A&E services in the UK. When it comes to education, 95% of Scots...
Long-term decline in reading, maths and science. You've fallen lower in the PISA
So the most
rankings.
important thing in education is destinations. Where do kids go? What do they go and do after school? 95% of Scotland's young kids go to positive destinations. That's work, university, apprenticeships, colleges. That's all really positive. So we need to sell our story a little bit. Because, as I say, the cost of living crisis, as it stands, for actually, not even as it stands, over the course of the last couple of years, it's been impacting folk. And for us, we've not been able to...
You've been in power since 2007. You have had that government to do whatever you wanted with Scotland for.
With all due respect, we don't get to do whatever we want in Scotland because we are...
Pretty much. Health, education, yes you do.
No. But we don't operate in isolation. We don't exist in a world where UK budgets don't impact, where austerity doesn't impact upon Scotland just because we're in charge. We've tried to mitigate against that. We don't have the bedroom tax in Scotland. Young people in Scotland don't pay tuition fees. Peak rail fares in Scotland have been scrapped. We've nationalised our rail industry. We have nationalised water. We have lower council bills. I could go through all of these things, but we don't operate in isolation.
Would you admit that whatever you're doing hasn't worked enough to keep people on side with what we would call mainstream politics now? They're pissed off.
I think you're fair to say folk are pissed off. I'd probably go a little bit further than that, to be honest. And I speak to folk in the pub about it. I speak to folk when I'm at my kids' football lessons and standing at the side of the pitch and all the rest of it, hearing what they've got to say. And folk are angry because they're working harder for less. We need to be able to convince them that we've got the solutions that will make their lives better. And over the course of the next 11 months, I think John will do that.
Don't you think there is a certain complacency in just saying, if only we explained it a bit better, then obviously people would come back to us and wouldn't vote for reform.
So maybe
I just think that's just sounds to me a sort of simplistic.
Yeah, maybe I've conveyed that poorly in that sense, John. I think people need to feel it. They need to know that the government's taken action, which has changed our lives. For a lot of us who've grown up in an SNP administration, we can recognise the changes that have came to us as a result of the likes of free tuition. But for a cohort of people who are struggling right now and have been struggling for a couple of years, they've perhaps not seen us as laser focused as we should be on their priorities.
And this talks to Emily's point that she was making about having been in power for so long. The SNP were for a long time was seen as the insurgency party. They wanted independence. They wanted to they were
They
the
still
change.
do.
Of course, yeah. Although it seems further away than ever, one could argue. You are now the establishment. You are seen as absolutely the establishment in Scotland, and it ain't a great place to be an established party right now.
Yeah, and look, I've actually pondered this quite a lot with some of my team, because I would hate to think that I'm ever portraying myself as the establishment. I think it's important.
In Westminster, you might not be, but in Scotland, you are.
And I think but I think what's important for the public is that what we want is something which is a change which is far greater than any change which has been offered at Westminster or will be offered at Westminster, which is for Scotland to take its future into its own hand, and all the responsibilities and challenges that come with that. And that requires ambition and hope and determination. And you know what? We can provide that for the people of Scotland, but we need to win. And in order to win, we have to be able to make a tangible difference to their lives so they feel it. And, going back to where this conversation started, we can't escape from the fact that the party's had a tough couple of years, and maybe the public lost a little bit of faith in us. And John's done a brilliant job of managing to steady that and make sure that people are listening to us again. But we need to get more than just listening. They need to vote for us again.
You said John's done a brilliant job. He was always seen as a slightly interim leader.
By who?
Well, that he took over in very difficult circumstances, and that he had kind of gone away from politics.
I think he said it himself.
Yeah,
He didn't say he was an interim leader, did he?
Well, I'm just wondering about.
I would contest that, Emily.
I was just wondering about Stephen Flynn, whether he'd like a seat in, I don't know, the Scottish Parliament. And
so it is my intention to stand for Holyrood. I'm seeking to be a candidate for the Scottish Parliament elections next year, in an area that's broadly similar to the seat I hold at Westminster. But you know what's important to me in this context? I got asked by the BBC just a couple of days ago about it. I was actually on their show to talk about oil and gas job losses in my constituency, and they asked me a very similar question. When when Humza Yousaf stood down as First Minister, the first person I called to take over was John Swinney. When Nicola Sturgeon, prior to that, announced that she was standing down, again, the first person I called to take over was John Swinney. Now, that's a wee bit of an insight into my thinking, and my thinking is very clear that John Swinney is by far the best person for the job. I think he's the best politician in Scotland. I think he displays that in Holyrood with acumen on a weekly basis. And I'm pretty confident over the course of the next 11 months he can make sure we're fighting fit to go on and win the election. The polls would indicate that we are going to win the election, but it can't be about polls. It has to be about policies and people. And when the SNP's focused on that and our ultimate goal of independence, we tend to do well.
Where are you with Grangemouth now?
So we're in the dire situation where obviously the refinery's shut, and for those people who work there, there's a huge amount of uncertainty. They've been promised a significant amount of money by the Prime Minister, £200 million, but it's actually part of the National Wealth Fund, so it's not even him who decides, it's an external body who'll decide. But this goes to the heart of the just transition and perhaps the lack of energy just transition that there's been. And if we go up to my own constituency, being a little bit parochial here, there's hundreds of job losses on a weekly basis. There was a report just last week by a very esteemed academic who I know in Aberdeen who outlined that there could be, I think it was 400 job losses every 2 weeks in the northeast of Scotland in the energy sector.
Are you
so
still a
I'm
net
worried.
zero party?
I'm absolutely in favour of net zero.
So how does that work then?
Because
I mean, how do you... net zero is fine until it hits my constituency and my job losses.
So it's not that at all, Emily. So net zero is not zero. So we're not arguing that we don't have oil and gas. Everyone expects that, but what you would seek to do is capture some of the carbon from what you require, because we're going to need it for decades to come. Even Independent Committee on Climate Change is clear about that. But what we can't do is shut down the industry or have policies which give effect to that whilst not having the jobs of tomorrow in place, whether that's in relation to carbon capture or offshore wind or onshore wind, hydrogen, hydro pump storage and so on. And that's my worry. I believe that we need to get to net zero as quickly as possible, but you can't have job losses on the way.
Increase in defence spending on nuclear armament, on the fleet of nuclear submarines. Are you saying that's terrible because we are anti-nuclear, we are... we want to get rid of Trident, or are you saying, jobs to the Clyde?
So you'll know my position in respect of nuclear weapons. I believe weapons of mass destruction are of something that should be consigned.
So the jobs shouldn't come to Scotland to build submarines.
So that's a separate issue from nuclear weapons, of course. What we're talking about there is conventional submarines, as I understand it going forward. Is it not, or are we talking about something slightly different? We're talking about Type 32s at
Well, it's just that there are going to be jobs coming to Scotland
from defence. But like that, so this argument's quite funny that like because if Scotland was independent, we wouldn't have a defence sector. If we look at Finland, which has a very long border with Russia, doesn't have nuclear weapons. It's a member of NATO, and it has significant conventional forces that would allow it to defend itself against any Russian attack. Now, I'd like to think that if Finland, as an independent nation, can achieve that, then Scotland could do so too. I'm definitely not anti-defence. I think it's hugely important. It's the first responsibility of any politician.
Finland is able to do that because it's under the NATO nuclear umbrella.
Yes, and of course we would want Scotland to be within NATO as well.
But this isn't about independence, though. Actually, it's a step back from that. If your party is anti-nuclear, then you presumably don't want to see any jobs related to the nuclear industry in Scotland.
Well, I'm anti-nuclear weapons, but let me flip the question for you, Emily. If Scotland were independent, do you think that a UK government, what was left of it, would want to have a situation where their nuclear weapons were sitting in a different country? I don't think they would want that to be the case. So
it's not the same question. The question for you is, are you happy with jobs going into the nuclear industry?
In support of nuclear weapons. I don't support nuclear weapons. I don't think they should be in Scotland. I am very familiar with the complexity of my own argument.
You're saying you're against nuclear weapons. Are you against those jobs?
But the jobs are inextricably tied to those nuclear weapons.
So you wouldn't want those jobs?
And those jobs would be the responsibility of somewhere else. What I would want to happen is for those people to be employed in conventional defence industries in Scotland in the same way that they are in Finland.
And if there was a defence contractor in your constituency that was going to be taking on 500 extra people because of the fact that there was going to be in some involvement in the nuclear weapons development that the government has announced, you would say we don't want these jobs here.
Well, what I would want would be for those jobs in the defence sector to be working on conventional forces.
So you would say we don't want those jobs?
No, I would say that I want those jobs, but I want those jobs in the conventional forces that
all other nations,
that multiple other nations in NATO have. Well, we make that the offer by being an independent nation that gets to decide on that. Right now, we don't get to decide that, John.
But that seems a sort of slightly tautological. It's a cute answer. It's not a real answer.
How is it not a real answer?
Because what we've had is that Keir Starmer has announced that they were going to develop the nuclear fleet of Trident submarines. That is going to create jobs, possibly in your constituency, possibly in other Scottish constituencies, and you've either got to say we don't want those jobs.
No, you don't. You don't have to say one or the other. You can say that what our aspiration is for Scotland to be an independent nation and have conventional defence forces like Finland. And nobody can reasonably say, I wouldn't expect either of you to say it for sure, that Finland doesn't know how to defend itself against Russia. It doesn't have nuclear weapons, so why is Scotland different?
Of course, I mean, one could argue that you say, well, I want the protection of nuclear weapons, I just don't want nuclear weapons, which is a sort of slightly kind of mealy-mouthed.
Again, I wouldn't suggest that the Finns who share a sea border with Russia are being mealy-mouthed in defence of their citizens. In fact, I would say that the Finnish people are being pretty robust in the front line of what is a totalitarian dictatorship in Russia that's seeking to put an end to democracy in Europe. And if the Finns are willing to go down that line, I think it's a pretty good starting point for Scotland to do that as well. So my argument to both of you would be that we shouldn't look at it through the prism of saying because the UK wants to do this, do you want this, yes or no? You should say, well, there's other examples out there of how you can do this better. Why don't we aspire for that?
So the SNP were at the forefront of those voices badgering Keir Starmer to change his mind on winter fuel. We've seen that now. We're going to have probably 9 million more pensioners, many of whom aren't on the breadline, aren't suffering greatly from having that 200, 300 quid taken away from them. They're going to have it reinstated. The generation gap has hugely widened between the amount that government spends on our pensioners and those it spends on younger people and working age families. Why did you call for that?
Firstly, our position on the winter fuel allowance was framed primarily around the fact that everyone knows that energy bills are through the roof, and we know that our pensioners, they don't have the ability to go and work in the same way that we do and to earn a crust. And as such, the impact of Labour's decision upon them in particular was massive. It pushed people into fuel poverty and probably pushed some people beyond that, and that's a devastating indictment of a Labour government. That was a choice that they made, and I think the fact that they've U-turned on that spectacularly, they appear to have actually spent more money in doing so when you add in the cumulative effect of the number of additional people who've taken on pension credit, is a reflection of the fact that they got this wrong and they were leaving pensioners cold in a very cold country when it comes to winter, in Scotland in particular. So that's why we called for this to be reversed. I don't think it should be looked at in isolation to say just because pensioners are getting this, why is someone else not getting things? And if we're going to look at working age families, we should be having a conversation around childcare, we should be having a conversation around rents and mortgages and so on. I think when you pit an element or group in society against another group in society, you're on the road to a discussion which I don't think leads to a particularly good place for anyone involved.
The government's, though, done the right thing, hasn't it?
It's done better than it did last year, that's for sure. I don't think it would be amiss for one of them to come on and say sorry, though. I've seen them all doing the media rounds saying that they made the right decision to leave people cold over winter, but now that the fiscal conditions are better, that they don't have to do that, notwithstanding the fact that the fiscal conditions don't appear to have improved at all, according to the OBR and the OECD. And I think the public can see through that, can they not? They're not daft. And I think when politicians treat the public in that way, they tend to get a response akin to, well, what the Labour Party got at the local elections in England, I suppose.
I want to talk to turn to Gaza. You will have seen the UK government has now sanctioned Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, two cabinet members, handing out travel bans and banning financial institutions from dealing with them. Thoughts?
I mean, will it make a difference? I mean, I'm pleased to see that there's progress, but you guys will be familiar with the fact that I've been banging on the door of Westminster since the very early days following the devastating attack on October the 7th to outline that Israel's response was not commensurate and it was collective punishment of the Palestinian people. We'll still be sending component parts from the UK to F-35s that bomb civilians, whilst at the same time arguing that people shouldn't be getting bombed and that there is a humanitarian crisis we should be responding to. The UK's position on this doesn't make sense. It hasn't made sense for very many months. And whilst there is some movement, some slow movement, it's not making a difference to Israel's position, and that's why we need to be clearer about where we stand with regards to the ICJ and the fact that for many people this represents genocide.
Because the Greens are calling on you, the SNP, to stop business grants to companies that have armed Israel. They say that you are funding Scottish companies that are still part of the arming of Israel. They think you're not doing enough. The
Greens think that we are not doing enough, so that's interesting. Of course, I would like to think that I've done more than enough in Westminster, and will continue to do. Actually, you know what? I can never do enough.
Should the SNP stop business grants to companies that are part of the arming of Israel?
At Westminster, but we're talking about Holyrood.
Yeah, okay. I would need to go and look at the specifics of what the Greens are referring to, Emily. I'm being genuinely what you hear.
Just as a question, I mean, should the SNP stop business grants to companies that are involved in the army of Israel?
But just because the Greens say that's happening, I've got no idea if it is happening. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that I do have the answer to that, because I don't know the specifics of what it is you're talking about.
All right, let me ask you something else, because the SNP's Brendan O'Hara criticised government and Labour MPs for meeting the Israeli president. Would you be telling SNP MPs not to visit Israel?
I don't think it would be wise to visit Israel. I imagine I'd probably get the same response that the couple of Labour MPs who did at the airport a few months ago, which was, well, did they not get taken aside and turned back home? I imagine that would be the response.
Do you think SNP MPs should not be visiting Israel now?
I mean, it's up to them to decide what they want to do. I'd be amazed if any of them did, because they're not daft and they probably know that what would happen is we'd get turned around and stuck on a plane right back out of Israel. Look, I'm deeply upset and angry about what's happened in Gaza and what continues to happen in Gaza, and the fact that the UK position has been so weak for far too long in respect of this. And I think it's important that you convey your views to people who are rational actors. I don't see... I
mean, they were meeting with the Israeli president.
Yeah, he's not a rational actor. Much of what he said is verging on endorsing, if it actually does endorse, ethnic cleansing and genocide. This is not a guy. This is not a guy you should be sitting down to have a chat with. And you know, I was just appalled and amazed at what I'd seen.
Do you mean the Israeli president or the Prime Minister?
The Herzog.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we've all seen it, and we've seen what these people have said and done over so many months and years. And you know, to go and sit and break bread with them, that's not for me. I'll meet with rational actors who want to protect civilian life. I'm not going to go and have a chat with people who want to destroy and devastate a community to the point of it no longer being in existence.
So just to sort of take this to a logical conclusion, if you had independence now, the SNP would not have any relations with the Israeli government?
Like I say, I would be keen to have relations with rational actors. I've seen, it's a long time ago now since I met the Israeli ambassador before, long before the horrors of October the 7th. But I've seen the things that she said since then. I've seen what senior Israeli politicians have said since then, and I find it difficult to comprehend how you can deal with people who are so insistent upon killing a civilian population in the way that they are. And we have red lines on this with other nations across the world. For some reason we don't in this instance, and I think that's a matter of great regret.
So just to follow up on Emily's question, you wouldn't have diplomatic relations with Israel at the moment
if you're in a position to have a rational. So John,
I know.
Yeah, if you're in a position to have a rational conversation with these people, we're not. And
so therefore you wouldn't have.
Yeah, so I've gone into the House of Commons on God knows how many occasions now and listened to David Lammy and Hamish Faulkner, the Middle East minister, I think he is, and they've told us, we're going to do this or we're going to do that, and this is the latest thing we're going to do. And then he stands up and says, but they're ignoring us. Well, if they're ignoring you,
but then would you
do something that captures their attention?
Let me just indulge me in. Emily's kind of idea that you've got independent Scotland, you are opening embassies around the world or closing them. Would you shut your embassy now in Jerusalem or Tel Aviv?
Yes.
Break off diplomatic relations with Israel?
Yes.
Stephen Flynn, thank you. Thanks for coming in.
Before we go, on yesterday's episode, we talked quite a lot about what was happening in LA with the deployment of 2,000 National Guard troops against the California governor's wishes, but Donald Trump kind of federalised what was happening in these protests about the deportation of illegal immigrants. Fascinating vote that took place in the House of Representatives last night. And this is where you see the political effect of Donald Trump and how he has split the Democratic Party into those who are absolutely condemning him and saying this is unacceptable. And 75 members of the Democratic caucus last night voted to say they supported what the immigration and customs enforcement officials were doing and saying what a great job they were doing. And the Democratic Party is honestly being torn to pieces by what Trump is doing.
Yeah, I think they are watching their back. There are 212 Democrats in the House. 113 voted against the resolution. And one of those who voted against it was Joe Neguse. Now, it's his district that saw the Boulder attack, the fire throwing into the crowd of peaceful protesters who were calling for the release of the Israeli hostages. And the Boulder attack, I think, was traced back ethnically to Egypt. Which is not one of the countries that Trump actually decided to ban from coming into the States. So I think people feel like instead of arguing the case or arguing the actual reality on the ground, they will get stymied with having a vote on what looks like the wrong side of the immigration debate or the anti-Semitism debate or the, foreign terrorist debate. And they're kind of paralysed at this point into just acting like an opposition party. I mean, that's what's extraordinary. We've talked for so long about how MAGA has taken over the Republican Party. We didn't actually expect them to take over the Democratic Party too.
And all at the time when Trump is deciding to deploy Marines on a major American city.
And when you say US Marines, you think of this is the deadliest force that America can deploy in a theatre of war. It was the Marines that in Iraq and Afghanistan, were the forward advance team that paved the way for the rest of US forces to come in.
Marines against American citizens who are protesting. Yeah.
We'll be back tomorrow with the US edition and probably a lot more on
we're going to be talking to Steve Bannon.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we think. Let's see.
Maybe. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye for now.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.